Welcome back to the Budget Wargamer. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Geeetech A10 3D printer, give you my thoughts on it, and also talk about some problems that I haven't seen others point out about it. First though, since this is a Budget Wargaming channel, let's have a discussion about FDM printing and why it might be useful for Budget Wargamers. If you're already familiar with this topic and you want to skip the basics, there's a timestamp in the description for you to skip ahead to the actual review. So first of all, is FDM printing budget friendly? First, let's talk about what is FDM, because some of you may not be familiar with this term. FDM printers like this one are printers which take a spool of plastic, they put it into this tube, heat it up in this hot end, and then slowly out of here, this hot nozzle, they will build up thin layers of plastic to create a model. FDM printers start at around $150, so there is some startup cost involved. There are cheaper models available, but they generally have very poor build quality or else poor safety features, so I wouldn't really recommend them. That's kind of around the minimum price range you're going to be looking at if you want to get into FDM printing. In addition to the printer by itself, you're also going to need to pick up a spool of material. For wargaming uses, PLA is generally considered to be the best. That usually runs between $15 to $30 US per kilogram. In addition, you may find yourself wanting to pick up some tools if you don't have them already. Socket wrenches are helpful for changing nozzles. You will need some cutters or pliers for removing supports. And for removing clogs, you may want to get some very fine needles. You typically will have one included in your printer, but if you will get other nozzles, then you will want to have needles for those nozzle sizes as well. If you need to clear up a more serious clog, then I would actually recommend getting a torch. Some printers will also be better with a few upgrades right out of the box. We're going to be talking about that later and how it applies to this printer. What about ongoing costs? Well, with FDM, a spool of PLA typically includes 1 kilogram of plastic, and that is enough to print hundreds of minis and lots of terrain. So the material is very cheap. And obviously with 3D printing, the more you're using it, the cheaper it's going to be. You may also want to factor in electricity costs if you are in a place where electricity is more expensive. For that, you can usually estimate that a printer is going to be using about 0.15 kilowatt hours of energy while it's printing. Also, FDM printers have a lot of moving parts, so eventually some things are going to fail on you. Consider your PTFE tubing, your fans, and your nozzles to all be expendable parts that will eventually require replacement. Fortunately, all of these parts are also very cheap, so the ongoing cost of FDM printing is actually quite low. But what about resin printing? Some of you may have heard of that, and how does it compare? Well, to be honest, resin is pretty much its own beast, and it comes with its own set of pros and cons. So stay tuned for a more detailed video about resin printing and its use in budget wargaming. In brief, FDM is more complicated to use than resin printers. It's going to have a steeper learning curve, but the material is much cheaper, and because of this larger bed, you can make much larger models on them. FDM is typically considered ideal for printing terrain, vehicles, and large monsters, as well as tools that you might use for wargaming, like movement trays or measuring sticks. Actually, the tripod that I'm filming this video on was also printed on this printer. Resin, meanwhile, is much better at producing detailed models. FDM can do it with a lot of calibration and practice, but resin is always going to look better. I'm not the best painter in the world, and I'm still learning with my printer, but here you can see some examples of some of the things that I have printed, and even a few things that I have painted. From terrain to some 1/72 scale 40K minis. This one in particular came out very nice. Spaceships for Battlefleet Gothic or other space combat games. Here's some more 1/72 minis. I've even experimented with printing 10mm scale minis. Now, this is really pushing the limits of what FDM printing can do, so it doesn't look the best, but if you're willing to accept some loss of detail, FDM printing can be perfectly serviceable, and printing these things is dirt cheap. Ultimately, what you can print really depends on just what sort of quality you're looking for. As you can see with this terrain, it prints beautifully when you are printing large pieces, and it's still not very expensive. What type of budget wargamers is FDM printing really for? Is it even worth considering? Well, in my opinion, yes, but that yes does come with an asterisk. So if you are someone who wants to get into games with more expensive minis or larger armies, like Warhammer or Kings of War, it'll be good for you. If you're someone who wants to make terrain, but you don't have the ability, the desire, the tools, or the space to be making it from scratch, FDM printing can help you. If you are someone who wants to have a large collection, but you aren't really financially able to build up such a large collection from more typical manufacturers, FDM printing is a really good way to do that because printing is just so cheap once you get past the startup costs. And if you are someone who actually wants to go into printing as a hobby, well, I expect you probably already know all of this, but just in case you don't, printing is fun. And it is at times stressful and frustrating when you don't know what's going wrong, but it is a fun hobby on its own, as I have discovered since I got a printer myself. But for everyone else, remember that printing is a hobby. FDM printers in particular are going to take time to learn, to calibrate the printer, time to troubleshoot problems, time to learn how to look at a model and know what settings you need to use. Fortunately, there are a lot of tutorials online that can help you along with the process. So let's get into this printer in particular. Now, you may notice that my A10 looks a little bit different, and that's just because I've added a few small mods to it. I've added a glass bed, as you can see here, a 5015 radial fan to improve the cooling, a printed fan duct to fit the fan, and also because my stock fan duct actually broke. I'll tell you about that in a second. And I also have a printed coupler here. I actually find that printed ones work better than the metal ones, especially the metal one that comes with the printer. It's cheap, and for me it only lasted about a month before it started breaking. And if we move this bed back, I also just have a really simple shroud to protect the main board from any falling pieces of plastic or anything like that. There are more mods I plan on doing for this printer, I just haven't gotten around to doing them yet. Also, it is important to note that this is a V4 model, or the 2019 model. There are earlier versions of the A10, and there are some differences between them, which we will talk about in just a little bit. There's also a new A10 Pro, which has come out recently, but because I don't actually have the A10 Pro, I can't really say much about it. Since the release of the A10 Pro, the A10 has dropped to $160 US, at least where I live, which is in Poland. So let's get on to the ratings. First of all, build quality. And for build quality, I would give it a 3.5 out of 5. Generally, this is a pretty stable machine with decent quality parts for the price. It has an all-metal construction, so it's not like those really cheap printers which have plastic railings and such, which are not going to give you the stability that you need. It has a double-wide y-axis, like the Ender 3 Pro, and while I did notice some ghosting out of the box, some belt tensioners here, especially on the x-axis, will help with that. However, there are a couple problems with the stock model. For one, the fan duct on the hot end is not very good, and it's made out of pretty cheap plastic. When I went to replace it, when I got my 5015 blower, I actually found that the fan duct was cracked on top. So not only was it not a very good duct to begin with, but it was leaking air in the wrong direction. Not a very good design. The extruder is plastic, and plastic extruders have problems. I've been meaning to replace mine. I haven't done it yet. So if you get any inconsistent extrusion with your A10, a really simple upgrade is just to buy a standard Mark 8 metal extruder feed kit. Same type that fits on an Ender 3 will also fit on this, since it is an Ender 3 clone. Or you can buy a BMG clone if you really want to be sure that you have a good grip on your filament. Finally, and this is the reason why I have a glass bed on here, the stock bed that came with the printer is actually pretty warped. You may not have this issue, but on mine it was quite high in the center, meaning that if I leveled the corners, then the center would be too high and it would scrape against the nozzle. And if I leveled so that the center would be right, then it would be the nozzle would be too high for printing on the sides. So I actually couldn't print anything very large at all without the bottom surface just looking terrible. I bought a glass bed. It's just a cheap 235 by 235 millimeter mirror, actually. Bought it off of a Polish website, and it has been the single best upgrade I have made to this printer. The bottom surfaces of prints, since I have gotten this, come out wonderfully, and I haven't had any issues with warping since then. Now, about earlier versions, the V4 actually has better build quality than earlier versions. It has moved the mainboard fan over to this side, and that actually gives some protection of the LCD screen cable, which is just back here. On previous versions, the screen cable was even more exposed, and it was very easy to accidentally damage it. There are also extra rollers on the hot end, which help keep the x-axis a little bit more stable. And finally, the breakout board on the hot end here has a more protected design. It actually has a shielding in the back so that you're not accidentally touching the electronics. About software and firmware, for that I would give this printer a 5 out of 5. I have been completely happy with how that has been. When you get it stock, it comes with Marlin 1.1.8, and it's usable with any slicing programs. Personally, I use Cura for most of my slicing. An SD card and USB cable are both included for connectivity, but the USB cable can be pretty buggy sometimes, especially it likes to reboot the printer over and over until you get it plugged in at just the right, I don't know, it needs the right something. And so that can be quite annoying to work with. So I recommend just using the SD card unless you have to use the USB for some reason. There is a semi-official port of Marlin 2 available. It's called Vert's Marlin 2. I will put a link in the description for that. So if you'll be looking for Marlin 2, it is available and easy to put on this printer. For me, flashing it was my first time ever flashing firmware, and it went totally smoothly. There was very little configuration I had to do, and there were no bugs, there were no issues, no errors. It just went totally smoothly. I think that this board handles flashing a little bit better than, for example, the Ender 3 board. I have heard of more people having trouble with flashing Marlin 2 on their Ender 3s, and everyone I've talked to with this printer has had no problem with it. Onto support, and by support I mean the community around the printer and the availability of mods and information online. And for this, I'm only going to give it a 2 out of 5. Support is a huge weakness of Geeetech printers in general, and this is no exception. In fact, I think the V4 actually has worse support than earlier versions. Not as many people have Geeetechs, they're not as popular of a brand, meaning that finding community can be harder, especially outside of the official forums. There are less mods available for it online. If you look on Thingiverse, it's just a mess. There's all different versions of parts for different versions of the A10. There's the A10M, the A10T, and there are small differences between each one of them that make it hard to know if something you find on Thingiverse will even be compatible with what you have. As an example, the V4 version has a differently shaped breakout board, so any mods which are either going to touch or go around or interact with this breakout board are not going to be compatible unless it's specifically made for the V4. The main board is in a completely different place. This fan's shroud, I had to adapt myself because nobody had made one for the V4. And that also means that information that you find online might not match the printer that you have. As an example, again, about this breakout board, when I was trying to find some images, some information, wiring diagrams, anything for it online, I couldn't find anything. All I could find was the older versions, and I had to kind of extrapolate that when I was wiring in my fan. So that's a pain, and that's really something that Geeetech can be doing better. Even in their manuals, they don't address a lot of these problems. Even more awkwardly about the A10, it seems like the hot end, or at least the heater block, are proprietary designs. So if you will have any problems with those, going to Geeetech or replacing it with a completely different model are pretty much your only options. But what about upgradability? Well, for that, I give it a 5 out of 5. This is the real strength of this printer. The stepper drivers are modular, so if you want to upgrade to, for example, silent drivers like TMC 2208s, you can do it. Just take the old ones out, pop in the TMCs, there you go. No problem. You don't have to replace the board. You don't have to really do much of anything. So I think that's very nice. This board is still pretty limited. It's still an 8-bit cheaper board, but it'll suffice unless you're really getting into DIY printing stuff. The extruder, thankfully, is actually using standard size parts, so it's just your typical Mark 8 extruder with a PC4 M6 coupler on the feed kit end and a PC4 M10 coupler on the hot end. The breakout board allows for 3 fans on your hot end, and you have separate connections for each one so that they are easily controllable in the firmware or in Cura. So really adding fans is just a solder and plug sort of situation. If anybody is wondering, in case you want to upgrade the fan on your A10, because this information is a little bit hard to find online, the connection type for the fan is a JST PH 2-pin connection. So you probably will have to buy those pins and solder it yourself, which is what I had to do, because most 2-pin fans are coming with a JST XH 2-pin connector, which is unfortunately slightly too large. Also, for the hot end, you're going to be wanting 24-volt fans, which are a little bit harder to find, but definitely still possible. In addition to that, the bed can be easily upgraded. My glass bed is actually just clipped on here, so there's very little to be done there if you want to upgrade it. And finally, the hot end also has this mount built in if you want to put in an auto leveling sensor. So if you want to have a printer that you can grow into and upgrade as you go, the A10 actually is quite good for that. Certainly much better than the Ender 3, where things are locked down. So overall, I would recommend this printer, but only to someone who either knows what they're doing or is willing to take on a project. You're going to have to grow with this printer, and it unfortunately only adds to the learning curve that already exists with FDM. I don't regret getting it, but I will say that if I had gotten an Ender 3, it would have been an easier learning curve, and the amount of time that I had spent trying to get prints like these would have been much less. However, it's a good printer, and in fact, in many ways, I like it better than the Ender 3. So if you're willing to stick through it and deal with the pain of not being able to find information, not being able to find some things, this printer will treat you well, and it's even cheaper than the Ender, especially now that the price has dropped. So I think it's definitely worth considering. One more bonus, though this is a pretty minor thing, it does actually come pre-assembled. The only thing that you have to do to assemble it is attach this gantry onto the main plate, attach the LCD screen, plug it in, well, plug in all the wiring really, and you're ready to go. So as far as a printer goes, this is as close to plug and play as you're going to get without accepting those mini desk sort of printers. So that's my review of the Geeetech A10. If you're a budget wargamer and you are looking for a cheap way to get into 3D printing, I think this is definitely something to consider, but be aware of the time it's going to take. And if you don't have that sort of time and you're willing to pay just a little bit more, then you may want to look at the Ender 3 Pro. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.